Hello, and welcome to the fourth in a series of 6 presentations in the State Historic Preservation Office Shut the Door! Barns in Oklahoma series, featuring Dr. Brad Bays, professor in the Oklahoma State University Geography Department. My name is Shay Otley, and I will be one of your moderators this evening. This presentation will be recorded and posted later for viewing. From 2009 to 2014, through a contract with the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office, Dr. Bays traveled the state of Oklahoma, visiting every county looking at historic barns. Tonight, Dr. Bays will discuss signs of ethnicity and adaptation in barns in Oklahoma. If you have questions, please post them to the Q&A feature of the application, and Linda Ozan will share those with Dr. Bays at the end of his presentation. Please note that the public will not see the question until it is published by the moderator. If we do not get to your question by the end of the evening, we will provide the questions to Dr. Bays and we will get back to you with an answer. Thank you for attending and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Shay. All right, thanks everybody for showing up again. Tonight we're going to look at some of the patterns that I have observed in terms of what we generally call sort of diffusion in geography. There are different kinds of diffusion. There's the diffusion of information that goes from person to person. There's diffusion of a disease, for example, the spread of a disease. We also have we classify a type of diffusion called relocation diffusion, which is associated with migration, when people take ideas with them and change the geography, change the landscape, perhaps, with ideas that came from another place. And that's one thing that has always been of great interest to me. When you see something that doesn't necessarily fit within the larger scheme of things, something that stands out because it's sort of unique, that might be the sign of, might be the sign of someone bringing it there. Now, tonight I'm going to depend a lot on this book called The Old Barn Book. It's been around for a little while, but it's by a geographer by the name of Alan Noble and another one by named Richard Cleek. We just call it the Noble and Cleek book. And this is, it's very accessible. If you're interested in barns, I would recommend it. The thing to remember, though, is that this book, like most of the scholarship on barns, historic barns, it has been done by people in either the Northeast, New England, Pennsylvania, New York. There's some fine work there. And the Middle West, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and to a lesser degree, the sort of the Great Lakes area, of course, part of the Midwest. But as you go farther and farther west, particularly after you cross the Mississippi River, there's not a lot of information about barns per se. There's a lot of scholarship on log buildings in the West. A lot of examinations of use of log construction, but Oklahoma was settled late and settled quickly, as we know, at least Oklahoma Territory, and because of that, I've always kind of wondered, what was the effect of that, So I've done my best to try to contain the number of photos to show you tonight. I'm going to have about 85 or something. And so first I want to start off with, I said signs of ethnicity and adaptation, but I'd like to sort of maybe rephrase signs of ethnicity. And this book is strong on ethnicity. That is, what are some signs of characteristics of buildings that were brought by different groups to the New World. We have English, we have German, we have, of course, you're probably familiar with the Dutch barn found in New Jersey and in New York. There are even Welsh barns, supposedly. Most of the in geography, we generally have an idea that over time things tend to become less and less certain, and as things diffuse over the landscape, the real easily identifiable characteristics get blended, and by the time they really have moved a long distance, it's probably really difficult to identify those traits. That's one approach. So I'm going to show you some examples here of this. I'll start off with something easy, and this is an illustration directly out of this book of a German ground barn, or Grundsteuer, and this was in Pennsylvania. And in this book, in the old barn book, focuses more on the Middle West and the East, and there are many different kinds of Pennsylvania German barns. Lots of good scholarship there. And this is one type of Pennsylvania German barn. It was introduced directly to the New World at some time in probably the 18th century, maybe a little earlier, but the middle part of the 18th century. And generally speaking, the scholarship says that you won't find these beyond the Middle West. Once you get into Illinois, you pretty much forget about it. And I had always subscribed to that until I went into Kay County where I was born, and wound up with this, which I think is a pretty good example of a German ground barn. Maybe even a better example from the book. But this is just one example of diffusion that may have occurred from an area where perhaps Germans migrated, perhaps into the lower Missouri Valley in Missouri. Perhaps some of those people made it to the Oklahoma Land Run, or at least the 1893 Cherokee Outlet Run, and settled into Kay County. So that's just one example of an ethnic pattern. Now, there are other examples in the book that, being in Oklahoma, I have to be really skeptical. And when I was doing the field work, I had at least early on, I had the temptation to want to see things that perhaps maybe weren't there, if that makes any sense. So I had an idea or conception of what I was looking for, especially when I went to somewhere like southeastern Lincoln County in Oklahoma, which is around Prague, which is one of the Czech settlement areas. And so I was of course looking for the Czech barn. And according to Margaret Geib, the Czech barn is characterized by an elongated shape, rectangular elongated shape, the incorporation of 2 or 3 different building materials, a gabled roof, a moderately pitched gable roof, and rather small windows. And as soon as I got to Prague, I looked and looked and looked, and I ran into something like this. Here we have it's a small building. It's elongated, rectangular. It's got, you can see, has native stone. It has what we call in the middle here. It's a type of a building material that is usually something you don't see. It's called terracotta load-bearing tile, and then of course you see brick up in the gable, and this is a fairly old building. It's supposedly 19-teens, 1920s, which I would probably agree with and probably accept. The windows or vents have been bricked in, so this is a traditional sort of building, or at least it was, and it kind of fits that idea of a Czech barn. Now, this is one of the areas of Oklahoma where Czech settlement was densest. But most of those people who migrated into southeastern Lincoln County were not coming directly from Central Europe, the Czech areas of Central Europe. They were generally coming from Nebraska. They were second generation Czech farmers. And so I'm kind of skeptical as to whether or not I'm just looking at something and wanting to see it, or whether this might actually be an example of a rendition of a traditional Czech barn. So I'm up in the air about this still. Now, I'm a little more certain that we have in northwest, west central Oklahoma, a good collection of what the scholars refer to as, for want of a better term, a German gable-end bank barn. Now, a bank barn is one that's built on a slope. It has two levels at least, and typically the ground level allows a wagon to drive in, and then you have using the slope, you have a basement section, usually where cattle are fed, and so you can store feed at the grade level by easily moving it without having to lift it, and you drop feed down into the basement. And of course, it's a lot easier to move manure out of the basement in the springtime. And manure was a very important resource, natural resource for farmers back in the early part of the century, until the early part of the century. So I know that we have, and these photos are by geographer Jordan McAllister. He has photographed a National Register property which is over by Covington in Garfield County, which is smack dab in the middle of the old wheat belt. And the wheat belt in Oklahoma was a big attraction for groups migrating, or put it this way, the area that became the wheat belt was very attractive to settlers coming from the Midwest, from the Indiana, Illinois region, Iowa also, and as well as the Corn Belt, the developing Corn Belt states, Nebraska and Dakotas, perhaps. So that area, of course, was an area of heavy German settlement, heavy Czech settlement. Later on, Germans from Russia, or Volga-Deutsch, or whatever you want to call them, people who were German, ethnic Germans who had lived in Russia, the southern parts of Russia, for nearly 100 years, and then they began to be persecuted by the Tsar, and they began to lose some of the rights that they had. So railroad companies from the United States recruited them to come to the Great Plains, and they came in large numbers. A lot of them came much later than other ethnic groups. So this is why we have in Oklahoma, there are a few groups, areas where Germans from Russia came pretty much directly from Russia. And so we have very, in Oklahoma, we don't have a lot of ethnic islands like, say, Minnesota or Wisconsin or Ohio, in terms of immigrants coming directly from the old country to the new world. We do have a lot of areas where migrants came from initial areas of settlement, and because of the land runs and so forth. So this is it's actually described in the National Register nomination as a German bank barn. And we'll notice here that there are two different types of bank barns, at least at the very least. There are the bank barns where the bank is, where the entry is on the gable end, as this one is. But if you go to, say, Holmes County, Ohio, you go to some of the Amish areas, you see other types of barns that typically will have the bank on the eave side. Most Pennsylvania barns are like that. So this is a little bit different, and although they're they're not spectacular, we do have quite a few of these in the northwestern part of the state. So you can see it, how nice this one is, 1906 territorial barn here. And we've got other ones around. So this is, the previous pictures were earlier. This is a gable end bank barn. I'm not going to call it a German gable end bank barn, but I know that the owner, the owner of this barn's grandfather built it, and that was right around 1899. So the present owner is still in the family, and this is just outside of, not very far from Stillwater. It's just in Noble County, and that is an area where a lot of Czechs and a lot of Germans from Russia, and perhaps German-derived immigrants from the Middle West arrived during the land run or after the land run. So I've always been intrigued by the fact that the land run generally was sort of like a big food processor when it comes to migration, because the assumption is that, if you're running for the best land, then you're not going to be systematically finding areas where your countrymen can join you and establish an ethnic island. There were examples, though, where people migrated after the land runs, say after the Cherokee Outlet Run, and tended to purchase land in large numbers, and families then, through chain migrations, families would join them in certain areas. So it's possible, but it's just not as easy to find ethnic islands in Oklahoma than you can elsewhere. But we do find remnants on the landscape of gable end bank barns, which reportedly are a German cultural form, and they tend to be fairly common through the northwestern parts of the state, mostly focused on the northern part of the winter wheat belt in Oklahoma, which is the southern part generally. And so I'll just show you a few more of these. One of them, which was kind of interesting, was a barn that was located on the home farm of Joseph Dana, and he was recognized as an early innovator in wheat strains. So here's a barn where he on the farm where he grew up. It's difficult to see some of these as bank barns, and this one I don't think is even a bank barn, but certainly they were from Nebraska. They were German in their ethnicity. Now this one is near Shattuck, Oklahoma, up in Ellis County, and this particular gable end bank barn had you can see that the land, the soil is really eroded from around it. Had a very deep concrete, foundation, hand poured concrete. You notice that the gable end had a bank, and this is sort of eroded away, but I'll show you some more photos of it here. The fact that it's in Ellis County is kind of unique, because Ellis County was a zone where a large group of Germans from Russia who came directly from Russia in the early part of the 20th century, relatively late, around 1912 or something, focused. And this is where they settled as a group. So we tend to see that. Now, this is a little farther west. This is a little closer to the Panhandle. Actually, this is in Texas County. And another German gable end bank barn. This one has actually had some extensions put around it. Okay, so that's German maybe some, I think we could, it may be a stretch to call them German, but certainly gable end bank barns perhaps derived from German areas. Now, the Middle West, at the time of the Oklahoma opening, was already, of course, world renowned as a massive, an important farm country. And geographers have, depending on, even the most cynical cultural geographers who don't really buy the survival of ethnic traits very much, even the most cynical of geographers agree that you can pretty much divide barns into a group that were known as the Middle Western barns and those that were associated with the upland South that were not used for things like feeding cattle. So we have dairy barns, we have other types of specialized barns, and then we have these large corn belt derived, what are just referred to as feeder barns, cattle feeder barns. I'm showing you this map to give you an idea of where Oklahoma is in general. This is an old map, 1926, of the agricultural specialization that had developed at that point, and from an issue of a journal called Economic Geography. The Corn Belt has expanded from Ohio. Of course, that Ohio would everything would later shift west. But the Corn Belt extended into Nebraska, up into South Dakota. South of the Corn Belt, we have a sort of a mixed area where the upland South and general farming, that is non-specialized farming, often associated with people who didn't have a lot of means. So mechanization was very slow to appear in places like this area of the corn and winter wheat zone, the general farming area. And then there's, of course, the Cotton Belt in the 1920s, and Oklahoma, including where I am here in Stillwater, even as far north as Stillwater, was very much a cotton producing area in 1926. And I believe it was in the 1920s that Oklahoma, one of the years of the agricultural census, Oklahoma ranked number 3 in the United States in cotton production, which is pretty amazing. Cotton is pretty much gone except from the southwestern parts of the state today, although it's coming back now and then. Now, the winter wheat region, the hard red winter wheat, the turkey red winter wheat, developed in the Middle East, brought to the Great Plains, and it emerged as a very important agricultural region, a specialization region. There's another wheat belt north of the corn belts, the spring wheat belt, where generally the seeds planted in the springtime and harvested in the late summer. In the case of the winter wheat belt, you plant in the late fall or late fall. The wheat germinates by November, December. It looks nice and green, and then it stays green throughout the winter months, and then begins to mature early on, so that by, depending on your latitude, by May, early June, at least at my latitude, it was always the first or second week of June that began to harvest winter wheat. Now, the area of great specialization of winter wheat was northwestern Oklahoma, western Kansas, eastern Colorado, and the Texas Panhandle. So that's pretty much the area that was the area of great specialization at the time. Now, there were some areas, most of Oklahoma, early on by, let's say, the time of the land run agriculture, and the agriculture that established in the 1890s and the early 1900s, most of that agriculture in Oklahoma was classified as general farming. Now, over time, the winter wheat region expanded, it diffused out from west central Kansas, into Oklahoma, into the Texas Panhandle. And so the general farming people took up more specialized winter wheat production. Then, when mechanization arrived, depending on when it happened, mechanization allowed farmers to invest entirely in winter wheat and larger farms of winter wheat, not needing draft animals anymore, using tractors. So there was a wave, if you will, from the 1890s until the 1920s, when general farmers in central and western Oklahoma shifted over from subsistence to cash grain. So they specialized. Now, most farmers in Oklahoma, the vast majority, were slow to mechanize. That is, most farmers did not own tractors until after World War II. Now, before World War II, they may have shared equipment with their neighbors. There may have been, 2 or 3 farmers that had one tractor. But unless the farms were incredibly productive, they generally waited to mechanize. And farmers who were mechanizing didn't get rid of their horses all at once either. So there was only one area really that mechanization hit before there was much of a population of general farmers using horsepower, using draft horses. And that was extreme western Oklahoma and the Panhandle, particularly the Panhandle of Oklahoma and Texas. That area was opened up to agriculture with mechanized agriculture, mechanized practices. So tractors arrived, and because of that, because of the fact that mechanization was really the first wave of agriculture in the far high plains, you don't find a lot of barns. Barns were not necessary, really. Okay, so here is I'm showing you the black square is to indicate Enid, which was one of the most important zones of collection of winter wheat. And this is the map of winter wheat production in 1925. So basically the emphasis on winter wheat. And you can see that over 50% or over 40% in most of the areas of northwestern Oklahoma were in winter wheat. Well, the Midwestern feeder barn, as I mentioned, was a barn that developed in the Middle West. It's usually assumed that it developed somewhere in the northern, or just north of the Ohio River, probably in Indiana, and began to be brought westward as the Corn Belt expanded. The Corn Belt system is all about producing corn and feeding corn to beef cattle. Now, it doesn't mean there's not dairy operations. This doesn't mean there aren't other types of farms. But the Corn Belt system of producing corn in order to market it as beef was a part of this expansion of the Corn Belt from the early 1800s to the present. And the area where Noble and Cleek identify as the feeder barn region of the United States doesn't even include Oklahoma. And that's largely because up until this time, we didn't have a lot of data on Oklahoma. But it makes sense that in the land runs, 1889, 1892, 1893, the people who were arriving into the unassigned lands, the Cherokee Outlet, maybe the Cheyenne and Arapaho lands in western Oklahoma, those people were coming from the Middle West. And the Middle Western, my own ancestors who came into on both sides of my mother and my father, their ancestors both originated in Indiana. And some of them stopped for a little while in Illinois, but they came from Indiana and Illinois to go to the Oklahoma land run. Many other Midwesterners came to Oklahoma for the Oklahoma land run. I've found barns that the owners, they've been in the family, or they knew some history of the barn, but it was, there were some that were built by people from New York. There were barns, big barns built from people from Minnesota, and certainly the Great Plains states, the Dakotas and Nebraska. So those areas, the source areas for the settlers of Oklahoma Territory, included the old stock Anglo-Americans. They included large numbers of people of German extraction, whether they came from Pennsylvania, it doesn't matter, or they came directly from Europe. There were lots and lots of Germans in this Corn Belt region. Not only that, but Germans from Russia later on, and of course Czechs. So all of those groups, and I've tried to sort of give you an example of some of the source areas within the Corn Belt region, migrated in the land runs and wound up in these areas that we're looking at. So this is, according to Noble and Cleek, a prototypical Corn Belt livestock feeder barn constructed of sawn lumber. And here is a farmstead that is located in Grant County, Oklahoma, and it is in the middle of the wheat belt. And you can see that the old farmhouse is abandoned, and you've got a couple of different barns. The one here in the middle is more than likely the general farming barn, and this large one over here would easily be classified as a Midwest livestock feeder barn, but it probably wasn't used for that. It wasn't used for feeding livestock. It was used as a general purpose barn. And throughout this area of from north central Oklahoma to northwestern Oklahoma, the first two tiers of counties from central Oklahoma, I would say Osage County to the Panhandle, have lots of these largest barns, or these large Midwest feeder barns. These are the largest barns in the state as a group. Now there are certainly there are gargantuan barns like the big sandstone barn near Red Rock in Noble County, but those are the oddities. These are the common large livestock feeder barns. And I'm just going to show you a handful of them because I've got a whole bunch of slides of these. And I think, once you've seen one Midwest livestock feeder barn, you've pretty much seen them all. Some of them are more attractive than others, but they are, they're huge. And what they are for, of course, is storing feed. And I mean, in the case of the livestock feeder barns here, their main purpose, well, they were general purpose barns when they were in this part of the country, but they were able to, they had huge capacity for storing loose hay in the hay mow. The hay mow in this barn is this huge area above the first ground level. And you can perhaps see the door right here. This is the hay mow door. In this case, the hay mow door has a hinge on it right here, so it would just flop down, and that's where you begin to load the hay. What's referred to often as the hay bonnet, or the hay hood, or perhaps just the peak. A lot of farmers just call it the peak. Is a support mechanism. It's part of the roof, but it's designed to support a steel train or trolley that runs the length of the ridge line of the roof and is able to drop a hay hook, or excuse me, a hay fork down to ground level. And then you would hoist loose hay out of a wagon and through a system of ropes and pulleys, move the large wad of hay around in the hay mow, drop it wherever you wanted it. Some of these barns, or all of them, you will have, you'll notice you'll have the hay trolley sticking out below the hay hood. Again, some people believe that this was like to keep rain out of the hay mow, which is not true. It's simply a support structure. And of course, you have a nice example of metal ridge ventilator, because a barn is really just a curing mechanism for hay, for the most part, and maybe some shelter for horses, work horses, for tack, maybe for dairy cows. Now, I'm referring to adaptation because one of the big adaptations in Oklahoma is that the winter wheat belt and the cotton belt and the general farming areas didn't stay like they were 100 years ago. The winter wheat belt became the winter wheat and beef beef production belt, if you will. So now there's a system where winter wheat is, and it's been like this for a long time, but where beef cattle and winter wheat go together. Beef cattle graze on winter wheat in the wintertime, and they're fed protein supplements perhaps and hay through the hardest part of the winter, and then you take the beef cattle off the wheat once it starts to get a little taller, and then it'll mature, and then you cut the wheat, or you bale it for other uses. The reason I have this photo is because the barn, if we go backwards, the barn symbolizes or represents a time when power on the farm was limited to a team of horses. And a team of horses can do a lot. They don't tend to break down like early tractors did. So often farmers kept their teams well into the 20th century. But the capacity of the farm, the production scale of the farm, greatly changed with mechanization. And the first tractors were small enough that you could easily get them in a barn like this. But the point was, if you no longer needed horses, you no longer needed to really store a lot of hay, unless you're at a dairy operation. And if you didn't need that, then the barn lost its purpose. Without the need for hay, barns became more or less obsolete. They became storage facilities. They became used for various things. But mechanization today, a winter wheat farm, a viable winter wheat farm today, has to have at least 3,000 acres in size to be to be profitable, and that's in okay years. So, but some more livestock feeder barns around the north central part of the state, and I'll move into another area here. So, adaptation, diffusion. Here I've got some examples of architectural features that are associated with the Amish. And we have 4 different Amish areas in the state. One is located over near Pryor, in that area. The latest area of Amish migration that's still ongoing, the Amish are still moving in, is down around Cole County, down here in the southeastern part of the state. And we have a large Mennonite population throughout northwestern Oklahoma. But the most traditional Amish populations, the old order Amish groups, are located in this area around Thomas and Corn and Dewey, in Ouachita and Custer County, excuse me. Here's an example of by any measure, an Amish barn, a large structure built with timbers and having a Pentus roof here on the end. Of course, I think the Amish sold it because there's an old clunker of a car there, and we know the Amish in this area didn't use cars. They're still around, but some of the characteristics that you would see regarding Amish barns from Ohio in the Noble and Cleek book are the presence of pent roofs, some other things like cross-gabled roofs, which I've seen around Pryor and Choteau. But these are this architectural feature that you're seeing, the pent roof, especially the wrapped pent roof, these are all clustered in the same small area within Ouachita County, Oklahoma. So it's a remnant of, and that, by the way, is a huge Amish barn built with timbers and very, very sturdy. Today, of course, it's not really recognizable so much as an Amish barn, but these are very different looking than any other barn you'll see in the region. They're just big, gabled, rectangular barns, sometimes usually with pent roofs. In this case, you've got kind of a little milk house over here, and it looks like we've got a sheep operation going on. So pent roof areas, all from the Amish country of western Oklahoma. Now, the weirdest, I guess, one of the weirdest things I saw a lot of weird things on this on this survey. Some things I don't really want to mention that are really weird, but one of the strangest things that I found early on was, after reading this book, there's something called the Scioto Valley Corn Crib. And the Scioto Valley, if you know your Ohio geography, is a river valley that flows down into the Ohio from sort of east central Ohio. And it's an important place because the Scioto Valley was it was early on thought the general area where the Corn Belt system got started. There's a pretty well-known book by an author by the name of Henline, who examined the development of cattle feeding, corn production, and feeding the surplus to beef cattle, and then marketing the beef cattle in places like Cincinnati. So that Scioto Valley area is important, and it catches your eye. But the Scioto Valley Corn Crib, I had no idea about, and this is what it's supposed to look like. And this is right out of this book. The Scioto Valley Corn Crib. Have a look at that. It's on concrete piers. It is elongated. It's basically got kind of what we would call a transverse frame sort of structure. It's got just a moderately pitched gabled roof. And this has loading hatches up here on the roof, I guess with an auger or something. And then it's got notice it's got a bank. It has a berm here that's raised up to allow a wagon to roll into it. And of course, it's just a huge area to store probably corn, okay, on the cob. In west central Oklahoma, in Blaine County, I ran into this. It looks a lot like the Scioto Valley Corn Crib. I'm not sure if I should call it that, but it has a much more sophisticated berm system or entry system. You can see here it's mostly eroded away. This is far enough west that it's actually in the red bed plain, so you see a lot of gypsum rock right here. But at one time, it looks like there was a way to load hay into that hay mow. But again, it's actually located between two high spots, and I'll show you, kind of rotate around here so you can see it. And of course, what you're looking at now is it's in the middle of a cattle pasture or beef cattle pasture, and really there is absolutely no use for this barn anymore, or this corn crib. But one of the weirdest things I've seen, I never saw another. Of the thousands of barns on the survey, I never saw another one like it. So you have unique oddities like this throughout the state. Now we'll move into adaptation briefly. And adaptation, I've tried to kind of stretch my mind a little bit here. I had a lot of things on the slate, but I'm saving those for the next presentation, which is about specialized buildings. And so adaptation, I've tried to limit a little bit. So one of the more obvious examples of adaptation I saw, or I've seen, is the use of certain forms for other uses. Now, as I mentioned, this is the way hay, that is loose hay, not baled, was traditionally loaded into the hay mow of a barn. Actually, the power was connected to a team, and through a pulley system that went all the way through the barn, up this way and over like this. If the team pulled up, they could lift the hay up, and then you could move it around on the hay trolley and drop it. The hay forks look something like this. This is an actual hay fork in a barn in Kay County, in a pretty good sized livestock feeder barn. And the hay forks are basically, are clasps, and you can control the clasps themselves. Are on a spring loaded thing, so they can open and close. But agricultural specialization is not forever. Agricultural regions fade away and are replaced by new activities. So the regions themselves don't allow for immediate, sometimes the regional change itself makes the tools of the farm obsolete. And so what are some ways that we've adapted to that? Well, I wanted to just show a picture like this. This is actually a Centennial farm up in Kay County. What is wrong with this picture? Well, this is, for most people in the state, this would look very normal. But in fact, a barn like this with beef cattle all around it is really not, this is not the way that whoever built the barn intended for this to be. So what you're seeing is the changeover from general farming or specialization in wheat or cotton. You're seeing that switch over to cow-calf operations. And cow-calf operations are basically you're feeding cattle and allowing heifers to get pregnant, and then and you have calves, and typically you might deal with yearlings, or you might deal with calves. So it's an operation that doesn't require, because of mechanization and because of all sorts of other innovations, barns are not part of that. Most people think that cattle need barns for shelter, and they don't. Beef cattle particularly. Beef cattle, if there is even any shelter, the only shelter that they usually get is something called a loafing shed. And this is a pretty typical example, not part of the original farm here, but it's been added on. And this is just an area. You'll notice that this is looking toward the northwest, and on a sunny winter day. And you can notice the cattle have a pretty good coat of fur on them, and the loafing shed will always face south, so that it's able to pick up the sunshine and allow some warmth to allow cattle to get out of the cold north wind, basically on real stormy days. So typically, the repurposing of dairy barns, of general purpose barns throughout the Midwest feeder barns, even typically the repurposing is for storage. You do everything you can to keep the beef cattle out of the barn, and that's what you always see. If there are cattle roaming around in a corral or wherever, they will usually be restricted from going into the barn, unless the repurposing of the barn includes some knocking down of a wall to allow to create a loafing shed from the old barn. Here's a good example of something from the past that has a new job but not really important, and that it's a little crib barn in southern Oklahoma. It had a hay mow, actually, or a loft, You could actually store loose hay in it in the old days. But now, of course, we've got square bales, we've got round bales. But the thing that I really want you to notice is the large um, protein feeder storage tank behind it. That's really the agriculture that is going on today. It's a cow calf operation, and some rancher stores as feed supplements in that large tank. You drive up underneath it with your truck. You fill up your cattle feeder, and you don't even have to get out of your pickup anymore. You just drive into each pasture and drop the load of pellets, and the cows by that time are headed your way. Another example of the past, and frankly, when you see a barn like this, remember that it's a remnant of the past. It's not part of the operation, and really never has been part of a cow-calf operation. All right. Another interesting adaptation is the transverse crib barn, which I had an entire presentation on. The transverse crib barn being used for things that it was never really designed for. But the transverse crib barn is nice because it's sort of like a Model T, in that the Model T did all kinds of different things. And the first people to have Model Ts, of course, were farmers before the city people got them. But the transverse crib barn is incredibly adaptable. When you get it out onto the high plains during the 19-teens, 1920s, when wheat farming was going full blast on the high plains, and this happens to be Texas. This is Beaver County. No, this is Cimarron County. This is Cimarron County, ground zero for the Dust Bowl. This was a transverse crib design that was nothing more than a granary, a wheat granary, a small grain storage facility. And you'll notice that here is an auger. An auger is essentially a big corkscrew that moves loose grain from one pile to another pile. And you take the auger and drop it up into one of these little chutes or openings in the roof, and you fill up the granary. A lot of farmers lost arms because they got their hand caught in an auger. They were part of the dangerous parts of working on a farm. But these granaries are so common in the Panhandle, particularly in Cimarron, Texas counties. You'll see that somebody has covered up the porthole entries on some of these, but they exist usually in clusters because they were basically storage facilities for the grain farm. Okay, now I'm going to call it an adaptation. That might be a stretch, but this is one of the patterns of things that exist in Oklahoma that I have really no explanation for. And it's called the braced hay hood. In some counties of northeastern Oklahoma, all Ozark counties, Adair, Cherokee, Delaware County, you find the use, and this is kind of the general area, you find the use of hay hoods that have braces on them. And the barn aficionados like to call these different things. Hanging gable makes the most sense to me. It's a braced hay hood with you'd expect to have a hay trolley on it, but it's braced. Perhaps that's because they're loading heavier hay, maybe green hay, I'm not sure. But throughout northeast Oklahoma, you find these. And it doesn't matter if you're one type of barn, it's not the particular barn builder, I'm certain of that. It's something to do with the area. But these are all from northeastern Oklahoma, from right around that same area. And braced hay hoods are the rule. It's hard to find a barn that doesn't have these. Okay, now, not northeast Oklahoma. I wanted to wind up with this, which is my claim to fame in Oklahoma is having found a third non-orthogonal barn. So it's not a round barn, it happens to be an octagonal barn. And on the theme of reuse or adaptation, strangely. This is located near Balco in Beaver County, in the Panhandle. And a friend of mine who's passed away now actually informed me of this. He was from Balco and told me all about this barn. Now, this little round barn, and most all round barns were built for dairy purposes. Dairy barns, of course, were needed in the Panhandle, especially when there were a lot more people living out there. So this barn, as an octagonal plan barn, built probably around 1910, I would guess. Obviously has a new coat, a new skin of siding, and the preservation office is saying, "Oh no, that's horrible," but it's going to protect it for a while. But this barn was originally a dairy barn. It's been it's been changed a little bit. You can see the cupola would have been a ventilation area. You would have had open air movement of, so you have airflow through the sides of the barns up through the cupola, the vent. If you look inside, though, this is the structure of the barn, and you have stanchions. And of course, those stanchions are places where the workers would milk cows. And those stanchions, then, the idea was that for some reason, it was somehow easier to clean up the manure, to feed the cows. Probably that's the case. But today, this little dairy barn, octagonal dairy barn in Beaver County, is used to sell hogs. It's the monthly hog auction barn. Finally, if you have a few more minutes, maybe one more minute, some oddities, and that is, we know that sometimes barns can be used for other things. Of course, now the big thing is weddings. We know that sometimes sometimes an old house might become used as a barn, but have you ever seen a barn that's been transformed into a church? And I'll leave you with this one. This was from the Czech area of Noble County. This little stone barn, and the Czechs love to build in stone, has a beautiful little arch on it. I'm going to go around here. You can see that somebody was careful enough to tell us the date that it was finished, 1908. And I think I'll leave it at that, and let you all figure out what the new use is, because that's a really big step, but it's not used for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brad. Linda's going to ask you some questions now.
Okay.
That we received.
Okay. By the way, that was a deer stand, that last one, in the middle of a big field, big pasture. Somebody had utilized that as a really, really comfortable deer stand.
That would have been a comfortable deer stand.
You enter it. There's a trap door inside beneath the whole thing, and it's locked up.
I think we lost Linda, and she had the questions.
Okay.
On her end. So we may have to get those to you and then get the responses to the people who asked them after the fact.
Okay.
Since I'm not sure if she's going to be able to get back on.
Okay.
Oh, wait, she's texting me now.
Yeah.
She said, is the hay hoods face a cardinal direction?
No. Usually they're not facing north, but not always. Typically you would want decent warmth, or I guess if you're loading hay, that's not really the case, but if you're unloading it, but generally no, that I've looked for that, and I haven't seen any particular way. Now, the only thing that you do find, of course, is that you build your house upwind of the barn most of the time.
I would hope so. That would be rather
I didn't,
uncomfortable.
I didn't get into it. I meant to also add another ethnic thing, and that was there's a German tradition of, at least in the United States, German immigrant farmer tradition of establishing the farmstead toward the center of the section. So rather than near the section line road, you go in toward the center of the section, and that's probably because of the tendency for people to homestead quarter sections in groups. That's just my guess, but there's actually been research on this in Missouri, that there's a tendency, an observable tendency for the German immigrants to site their farmsteads away from the road toward the inside of the property, and that's I've observed that also.
That's interesting. Okay, so last question. Does building material indicate any ethnic traits? Like, does certain masonry belong to one group over another?
Not in Oklahoma, I wouldn't say. And I mean, the only place that I think you might begin to go there would be with regard to the checks, and that I'm not convinced that that's important. And you do see a tendency more, though. I don't think it's a matter of what the particular material is, but building in stone tends to be something that's more continental Europe. But then again, that might be a bias, because stone buildings tend to last longer than others. So I'm not real sure about that. I do know that people utilized often what was nearby, and I think I showed you on an earlier presentation a bank barn, which was actually, rather than sandstone or limestone, they used gypsum, and the gypsum was actually kind of a gypsum sandstone mix, but it's very, very brittle. It's very soft. I don't know why anybody would want to build a foundation out of the stuff. Over 100 years, the buildings that I was looking at, over about 100 years or so, the gypsum sort of melts and sort of fuses together, and it's kind of interesting that way. But because gypsum is water soluble and it flows. So I did have a few pictures on sandstone being used as far northwest as the Mesa country, as Black, actually with Black Mesa in the background. There's a very large barn built out of the relatively young sandstone up there. But essentially, people use what they have access to. I would go with that rule.
Okay.
What they have access to.
Sounds good. Well, I think that's all the questions that we have for now. Thank you, Brad. And we thank everyone for attending the 4th Shut the Door Barns in Oklahoma presentation. And we hope that you'll sign up for the 5th presentation, Oklahoma's Special Purpose Barns and Farm Structures. That will be held on October 25th at 6 p.m. We hope to see you there, and have a great evening.